Hello, ho, ho, folks. I'm Santanon, and this is the only news that matters. In the last video, I mentioned I'd be doing a video on Mothman. Well, that's this video. The Mothman was a creature first seen in Point Pleasant, West Virginia from November 15th, 1966 through December 15th of 1967. So for exactly 1 year and 1 month, this thing was traipsing around Point Pleasant, West Virginia, terrorizing locals. Mothman wasn't the only thing terrorizing the locals, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To fully understand the story, we must go back to the beginning. And by beginning, I mean before there was ever even a United States. The early 1770s, when America was still under British rule and the Revolution had yet to boil to the surface. The American colonists were continuing to encroach on the Native American lands, moving westward. So, the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Wendat, the Mingo, the Miami, the Ottawa, and the Illinois tribes all banded together to become the Seven Nations. The most powerful of those 7 native nations was said to be the Shawnee, who were led by Chief Cornstalk. By 1774, American colonists had moved into the Point Pleasant, West Virginia area, though at that time it was just Point Pleasant, Virginia. The Seven Nations Confederacy sent 1,200 warriors to the Point Pleasant area to make a surprise attack to drive the colonists out, but the colonists caught on and arrived with the cavalry and with a crap ton of musket fire. The colonists lost about 140 men, and the Seven Nations lost over double that amount. The Native Americans retreated, and the colonists built a fort at the fork of the 2 rivers in that area, the Ohio River and the Kanawha River, which is where modern-day Point Pleasant sits. By 1777, the American Revolution was full-blown raging, and the Brits were pressuring the natives to side with them. The Brits were promising the natives freedom and land and peace if they just helped the Limeys beat those pesky revolutionaries. The Seven Nations Confederacy was poised to side with the Brits, but Chief Cornstalk smelled bullshit. So him, an unnamed Native American, and a man named Chief Red Hawk, who was the leader of the Delaware tribe, all went to the fort, which at that point was controlled by pro-American revolutionary forces. On November 7th, 1777, they met Captain Arbuckle. Cornstalk and Red Hawk explained the situation. They wanted a treaty with the Americans, certain guarantees of peace and land, etc. They wanted this treaty so the natives could avoid helping the British. But they did let Captain Arbuckle know that if the treaty was not reached and any of the 7 nations attacked the Americans, Cornstalk and Red Hawk would have no choice but to join the attack and support their people. Arbuckle responded by having Cornstalk, Red Hawk, and the unnamed Native American arrested. And then later at some point, Cornstalk's son was also arrested. Then 3 days later, on November 10th of 1777, 2 soldiers from the fort were out hunting for meat when they were allegedly attacked by natives hiding in the forest. 1 soldier was killed, and the other only lived long enough to make it back to the fort to tell his tale. The soldiers inside the fort were enraged, and against orders they stormed the cell containing the 4 Native American men. Cornstalk's son was shot dead instantly. The unnamed man was strangled to death, and while that was going on, Red Hawk tried to escape through a chimney, but he was captured and killed. The soldiers then turned all their anger, aggression, and evil intentions onto Chief Cornstalk. He was shot 8 times with the musket. As he lay dying, he looked his attackers in the eyes and proclaimed, "I was the borderman's friend. Many times I have saved him and his people from harm. I never warred with you, but only to protect our wigwams and lands. I refuse to join your pale-faced enemies with the redcoats. I came to this fort as your friend, and you murdered me. You have murdered by my side my young son. For this, May the curse of the Great Spirit rest upon this land. May it be blighted by nature. May it even be blighted in its hopes. May the strength of its people be paralyzed by the stains of our blood. And the curse? Well, it pretty much lay dormant until 1907, when a string of tragedies started being associated with Chief Cornstalk's curse. In 1907, the worst coal mine disaster in U.S. history left 310 people dead. In 1944, 150 people were murdered by a surprise tornado. In 1967, the Silver Bridge over the Ohio River collapsed and killed 46 people. In 1968, a Piedmont Airlines airplane crashed, killing 35 people. In 1970, a Southern Airways plane had crashed, killing 75 folks. In 1978, a freight train derailed, causing a toxic spill that contaminated the townfolk's wells and the city's water supply. Also in 1978, 51 men were killed at a power plant in the area during a construction accident. The list goes on, and those are just some of the more major events associated with the curse. One of those events, in particular, relates directly to the Mothman as well. Even before the Mothman, Point Pleasant was known to have weird UFO phenomenon and other paranormal activity, all associated with the curse. It was a smallish town, the stereotypical kind where everyone knew everyone. So when someone came forward with strange sightings or an experience, it was considered credible and it was taken seriously. We're going to deep dive into the Mothman now, but to do that, we need to go to a few days before the Mothman phenomenon actually started. November 2nd, 1966, in Ohio, not too far from the West Virginia border. A man named Woodrow Derenberger was on his way home traveling along I-77 near Route 47. He thought he noticed a tractor trailer behind him, and for some reason it had its lights off. It appeared to be right on his back bumper, so he pulled off of the road. The tractor trailer then took flight and flew right over Derenberger's car. That's when he realized it was an oil lamp-shaped UFO, not a tractor trailer. It hovered for a moment in front of his car, touched down, opened up, and a man stepped out. The man was of average height and average looking, with slick black hair, dark clothing, and a dark heavy overcoat with a slanted nose and high cheekbones. He had a smile plastered on his face. The stranger didn't speak, but telepathically Derenberger heard the stranger say, "Do not be afraid. I mean you no harm. I want to ask you some questions. Roll down the window." In a trance-like state, Derenberger rolled down the window. The stranger explained that he could hear Derenberger, whether Derenberger actually spoke or just thought the words. The whole time, the stranger is continually smiling, never stopping the creepy smile. He introduced himself as Indrid Cold, and then pointed at the lights of a nearby city and asked Derenberger, "What do you call that?" "It's a city. We call it Parkersburg." "Where I'm from, we call it a gathering. I come from a place less powerful than yours. Do people live, or do they work in this Parkersburg?" They live and both. They live and work there." "Do you have a job?" I'm a salesman. Do you have a job?" "Yes, I am a searcher. Why are you so frightened? We mean you no harm. We eat and bleed the same as you. We only wish you happiness. At the proper time, authorities will be informed of our meeting, and it will be confirmed." Indrid then turned, got in his craft, and flew away extremely fast. When Derenberger got home, and he lived in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, by the way, he immediately called the cops. As I mentioned earlier, small town, everyone knows everyone. So the story is taken seriously and investigated. The police interviewed Derenberger that night. The next day, a local news channel grilled the hell out of Derenberger, and his story held up. Later that same day, he was re-interviewed by police, and the story still held up to scrutiny. Then the Wood City Airport Authority interviewed Derenberger, and his story still held up. And finally, some representatives from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base showed up, the same guys who investigated Roswell, and they interviewed Derenberger, and his story still held up. Then the men in black showed up and started harassing Derenberger, intimidating him into not talking. At the same time, representatives from Nightcap were also harassing Derenberger. And throughout this time, Indrid was occasionally showing up to Derenberger's farm with his creepy smile and hanging out at the hay barn with Derenberger. And Derenberger started to get really stressed, started having troubles at his job and troubles within his marriage. Eventually he cracked. He gave Nightcap full control of the investigation, so the other investigations were dropped by other agencies. Then Derenberger went missing for 6 months, and when he showed back up, he said that he had been with Indrid, and they went to Indrid's home planet of Lamulus, which is in the Ganymede galaxy, where no one wore clothes and the galaxy was completely peaceful with no wars. And he also claimed that he had been impregnated by the aliens, which is why he was gone for 6 months. Eventually Derenberger and his family moved away, and he wrote a book, and then he passed away sometime later. His daughter did claim that Indrid Cold showed up at her father's funeral, though. Bullshit. My point in bringing up Indrid Cold is because his appearance in this area is inevitably linked to the appearance of the Mothman, and it also shows just the scope of weird UFO alien shit going on in that area at that time. A few days after the Indrid Cold saga began, November of 1966, 5 workers in a graveyard in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, saw a brownish, grayish creature that happened to be like 7 feet tall and have giant bat-like wings. They say it rose directly in the air and flew away. The area of Point Pleasant, as I mentioned earlier, is at the fork of 2 rivers. There was also a naval installation near there as well, at some point in history. And there's the abandoned munitions factory. Back in World War II, munitions were produced in that area. And since World War II was long over, the munitions factory had essentially been abandoned. The locals referred to it as the TNT factory. And locals would go out there, mainly teenagers. It was the local hookup spot, like the lookout point. And in that area, there's hundreds of acres of dense woods with crumbling remains of the factory. And there's crumbling like bunkers, concrete pillars, concrete domes. And it's even said that some of those bunkers and domes still contain munitions. That stuff litters the surrounding area. And there's also tunnels that run underground in that area. It's a pretty creepy place for a hookup spot, but whatever, it's the perfect setting for our Mothman story to really kick off. So on November 15th, 1966, 2 couples, Steve and Mary Millette, or Millay, I'm just going to call them Mollette, and Roger and Linda Scarberry, called the police and reported that while they were all near the TNT factory, they witnessed a giant gray flying man with a 10-foot wingspan, making noises like a screaming woman. They said it had glowing red eyes. So on November 16th, the next day, the police had a press conference explaining the sighting and explaining that they were taking it seriously and investigating, and urging the citizens to exercise caution, but also urging the same citizens to be observant. The news took this seriously as well. It's important that no one was ever really seen as a crackpot in any of these situations. The press did dub the creature Mothman because of the Batman villain Killer Moth, which is a villain I didn't know about until doing research for this episode. But Killer Moth is badass. He was essentially an evil Batman. Like Batman, he had no superpowers, but he also had a bunch of gadgets like Batman. But his gadgets were to kill. Anyways, thought that was an interesting reasoning behind the name of the Mothman. Back to the main story. Also on November 16th, Ralph Thomas, who lived near the TNT factory, noticed red glowing eyes flying around the sky. This is the same day as the press conference. Marcella Bennett, who was down the road from Ralph's, also noticed the eyes. So she grabbed her baby and drove over to Ralph Thomas's house. As she parked, she got her baby out of the car, and the Mothman stood up from a crouched position behind her car. It shrieked and spread its bat-like wings. Miss Bennett was so startled, she dropped her baby and ran in the house. I mean, she picked up her baby first, but she ran in the house immediately afterwards. She still dropped her damn baby. Ralph locked all the doors, and the Mothman crept around the outside of the house, peering in the windows with its glowing red eyes. The cops had been called, but the Mothman flew away before authorities arrived. The town at this point was terrified. And this was a town where weird shit happened all the time. UFO sightings were commonplace. Poltergeist activity was just an accepted part of everyday life. Car engines were known to stall when driving near the TNT factory. Weird shit went on all the time, and we'd be here all day if I tried to list it all. But now the town was thoroughly freaked out. 2 firefighters described seeing the Mothman, and they didn't know if it was a flying humanoid or a large bird. Cars in that area of the TNT factory were now subject to being chased by the Mothman. Some chases reportedly even reaching speeds of 100 miles per hour. A local contractor named Newell Partridge had a run-in where the Mothman terrorized his dog. Then his dog disappeared. Afterwards, Mr. Partridge's television was always static. He could never get a good signal. And he would receive weird static and electronic sounding phone calls with beeps and weird whispers. Anyone who had a run-in with Mothman at their homes reported similar things in regards to the phone and television issue. Another big issue was the sunburns and conjunctivitis. See, anyone who had a run-in with Mothman and saw his glowing red eyes had debilitating conjunctivitis, described as Klieg conjunctivitis. It's essentially like sunburn to the eyes. There was even a report of a couple getting naked in a car at the TNT factory, because hookup spot. And the light from either Mothman's eyes or a passing UFO shined in the car over their bodies and severely sunburned their whole bodies, genitals included. Because of the history of weird shit and the appearance of Indrid Cold and the Mothman in that area, 2 men showed up independently of one another to investigate the happenings in Point Pleasant. One of those men was Gray Barker, the guy who first brought attention to the Men in Black phenomenon. He wrote his book and also told the stories of Harold Dahl and Albert K. Bender, which, for more information on those two and their interactions with the Men in Black, you can check out my video from last week. The other man to show up in Point Pleasant to do an investigation into all the weird shit was a man named John Keel, who is most famous for writing the book that brought the Mothman to the nation's attention, The Mothman Prophecies. And yes, the movie of the same name is based off of Mr. Keel's book. Also, the Men in Black started showing up in and around that area. A lady who wished to be anonymous, 12 minutes away from Point Pleasant, was walking out of her office building late at night when a cylindrical oil lamp style UFO hovered in the parking lot and landed. It opened up. 2 identical looking men stepped out. They were tall with slanted noses and high cheekbones. They were dressed in black clothing. They approached the woman and with high-pitched sing-song voices started asking her random questions until they got stuck on one phrase.
What is your time? What is your time? What is your time?
Then eventually the 2 men got in the UFO and flew away. The same woman said 2 weeks later, the 2 men passed her on the sidewalk, this time wearing normal clothing, and they nodded at her. A few weeks after that, a woman who wrote a weekly column for the Athens Messenger covering the UFO and paranormal happenings in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, had a similar strange run-in with Mibbs. This woman was named Mary Hyre. One day, a man between the height of 4.5 to 5 feet, with a ridiculous bowl cut and a dark suit on, shows up at her office. He needed directions to a nearby town. Mary thought this was weird because she was a newspaper columnist, and why would this guy show up asking for her and then only ask her for directions? He also seemed obsessed with a ballpoint pen on her desk. So, since Mary was weirded out, she just gave him the ballpoint pen. And she said the little man let out a high-pitched shrieking laugh and ran off clutching the pen. No directions needed after all. That night, she saw a UFO light up her backyard. Smartly, she avoided contacting the UFO. The next day, she's doing her job when two identical men with slanted noses and high cheekbones and dark suits show up to her office and ask her,
What would you do if someone ordered you to stop writing about UFOs?
She told the twin Mibs that she'd tell that person to go to hell, and then the two men left. Later that day, a man with a stutter and an unidentifiable accent, wearing a dark suit with long, spindly fingers, shows up to Mary's office. He introduces himself as Mr. Brown and claims he's a UFO researcher. She's wigged out by this dude immediately, and she also notices he too is focusing on a ballpoint pen on her desk. He started asking her,
What would you do if someone ordered you to stop writing about UFOs?
And this intrigued Mary, so she asked if he was with the twins from earlier. The stuttering man replied,
No, I am friends with Gray Barker.
Mary, who had worked with Gray Barker in the past, let the stuttering man know that she knew Gray as well. Then she asked the man if he knew John Keel, whom Mary had also been doing some work with recently. The man replied,
John Keel is a liar.
Then he started staring at the pen again and asking Mary to take him around to where UFOs and Mothman sightings happen, while also still shit-talking John Keel for some reason. Mary refused to take Mr. Brown anywhere. Then Mr. Brown left and showed up at Connie Carpenter's house. Connie was one of the first people in town to have seen the Mothman. She had been on her way to church when Mothman swooped down at her car, and she got some real bad pink eye out of the whole deal because he shined her with his weird conjunctivitis sunburn eyes. And she had been receiving the phone calls and the weird static TV shit, and now this weird man shows up, and all he wants to talk to Connie Carpenter about is the relationship between Mary Hyre and John Keel. Doesn't really seem like he cares about Mothman or UFOs or any of that. Connie Carpenter got the dude to leave, and then he shows up down the road at Mabel McDaniel's house. Mabel McDaniel had seen the Mothman flying around and above a local restaurant recently, and now Mabel was having a family and friends get-together barbecue thingy, and the weird stuttering man shows up, says he's friends with Mary Hyre and John Keel, so they allow him to enter the party. And the stuttering man has this gigantic old tape recorder. He sat at a table for a while, messing with the tape recorder, but couldn't ever get it to turn on. But he still took the microphone and kept shoving it in random people's faces, asking things like,
Do you know John Keel is a liar?
And
what would Mary Hyre do if someone ordered her to stop writing about UFOs?
he never asked about UFOs directly, or Mothman. He just kept shit-talking John Keel and trying to figure out the relationship between John Keel and Mary Hyre. Then the stuttering man got stuck on a phrase. The witnesses to this event say the man would repeat multiple times, to each person he talked to,
They are not hostile. They are not hostile. They are not hostile.
without ever explaining who they was. Then Mr. Brown just kind of left the party and left everybody's life. But after that day, the MIB seemed to descend on the town of Point Pleasant. It's like weird Mr. Brown unleashed a mob of men in dark suits. During that time, Mothman sightings went up. So did the poltergeist activity in town, as well as the alien sightings, UFOs, and shit just started going crazy. Remember Marcella Bennett, the lady who dropped her baby when she saw Mothman? Well, she recovered from her horrible pink eye and was driving when a man in a dark car wearing a bushy red clown wig and a dark suit ran her off the road while making eye contact with her the whole time. Also, anywhere anyone in town saw a UFO or Mothman or whatever, the next day in the exact same spot, strange acting and strangely dressed men, clearly men in black, would show up in that exact spot, acting all weird and using weird equipment that wasn't plugged in. Also, droves of limos were driving around town door to door, and men in dark suits were claiming to be census takers while asking weird questions about the children of each household. While all this is happening, Gray Barker was doing his investigation. John Keel was doing his investigation. You had the NICAP investigating crap. The MIBs are showing up and acting really weird and just freaking everybody out. Maybe they were investigating too. And then the local sheriff's office was also investigating as well. In fact, Sheriff George Johnson thought the Mothman might be a heron, which is a bird that George Johnson, the sheriff, called a shite poke. Most people didn't agree with the sheriff, but there was a West Virginia University wildlife biologist who said the Mothman was just a sandhill crane. Which, those cranes do have large wingspans and they're tall as fuck and just freaky on their own. But that thing don't look like a fucking Mothman. It looks like something from, the new Jurassic Park movie. But not a Mothman. Basically, the townsfolk, the investigators from everywhere else, everybody was confused and freaked out as to what the hell was going on. Then, 600 miles away, in Mount Misery, Long Island, in the state of New York, near where some other sightings of Indrid Cold had happened shortly after he appeared in the Ohio-West Virginia area. A lady who only ever identified herself as Jane was abducted one night alongside her boyfriend from their car. After that, for months, she received, the weird phone calls with the beeps and the static and the random white noises and all that weird stuff. And then one day, the phone rang. And a voice said, "Do not speak, I cannot hear you. Listen closely." Then it told her to go to a specific local library at a specific time and look at a specific page of a specific book on Native American history. So the next day, Jane made her way to the library because she was like,
"Yeah, I've already been abducted. Why fucking not just go to the library?"
When she got there, the library was empty. Except for a creepy librarian lady who only spoke in broken English and wore dark clothing. The librarian had a slanted nose and high cheekbones and weird eyes. And she already had the book that Jane needed. She opened the Native American history book to the specified page, which happened to be about Chief Cornstalk and his curse. The text on the page shrunk, disappeared, then reappeared in a larger font with completely different words. The message contained within the book said,
"This is a message concerning Earth and its people. Time is set. Fear not. I am a friend, and for reasons known only to ourselves, you must make your contacts to one reliable person. To break this code is to break contract. Proof shall be given. Notes should be kept. Be in peace. Signed, Apol."
And that's signed Apol, A-P-O-L. After that, Jane was weirded out, so she left the library. She said that for weeks afterwards, everywhere she went, the librarian lady seemed to be there. Then one day, Jane thought she had given the librarian the slip when the creepy librarian popped out from an alleyway, laughed weirdly, and asked,
Is there any AU here?
AU meaning gold. When Jane couldn't respond in time, the lady then said,
Peter is coming. Why are you interested in our mount? Peter is coming.
Then a black Cadillac pulled up alongside them both. Two identical men in dark gray suits with slanted noses and high cheekbones got out of the car. Then the driver window rolled down, and a man with a pointy, slanted nose, slick black hair, high cheekbones, and a dark suit introduced himself to Jane as Apol, A-P-O-L. Jane said Apol's hands were cold as ice. He handed a small silver disc and shook her hand. And then he told her,
Wear this always so they know who you are.
Jane was weirded out by this whole situation, so she contacted John Keel, who was one of the nation's foremost paranormal, high-strangeness researchers at that time. And at this point, John Keel was traveling back and forth from the New York area to the Point Pleasant, West Virginia area at the same time, doing his Mothman investigations. Keel got Jane to send the disc to him, and he examined it, but he couldn't find anything interesting about it. He mailed it back to Jane, and when Jane received the disc, it was all burnt up and bent, and it smelled of sulfur. So John Keel decided to meet with Jane. He put her under hypnosis to interview her about Apol and everything that had gone on. Instead, Apol took over Jane's body. At first, all Apol wanted to talk about was Robert Kennedy having an affair with Marilyn Monroe, which admittedly is pretty weird because Marilyn Monroe had been dead for like 5 years at that point, but whatever. But John Keel was able to steer Apol back on the topic, and then Apol warned of an upcoming disaster over the Ohio River in the Point Pleasant, West Virginia area. Immediately, John Keel wrote a letter to Mary Hyre telling her that some sort of disaster not related to the UFO or Mothman phenomenon was imminent. But Keel wasn't sure how this disaster would manifest. He told Mary Hyre not to tell anyone, and also told her to be safe. Then, on December 15th, 1967, the Mothman sightings as well as the MIB encounters ceased, and the Silver Bridge over the Ohio River collapsed, killing 46 people. 2 days before the collapse, town folks had noticed strange men, like the weird dressed up men in black workers, in dark work suits crawling under, on, and around the bridge and using strange equipment to scan the bridge. So why did the bridge collapse? Did the MIBs have something to do with it? Did the Mothman or the UFOs? Or was it because of Chief Cornstalk's curse? Or maybe all this, the Mothman, the disasters, the MIBs, the UFOs, the paranormal activity, was all because of the curse? And what about Indrid Cold and that Apol guy? That was my goal when doing this episode, was to solve it all, put it all together, and figure it out. And I have. See, the Mothman has been tied to other disasters as well. Sightings had been reported leading up to the 1999 Russian apartment burnings and bombings and all that. And for more information on those, you can actually watch my Alexander Litvinenko video. And also, in late 2010 and early 2011, in the New Jersey area, Mothman was spotted for a while, and then after the sighting stopped, an apartment complex burnt down. Mothman was reported to be in Russia before the Chernobyl disaster happened. He's been seen all over the world leading up to disasters of all sorts. In Point Pleasant alone, that 1 year and 1 month, over 100 people are on record with run-ins with the Mothman. And that's not counting all the ones who didn't want to come forward because of fear. In 2016, this photo was released. It was taken near Point Pleasant off of Route 2, showing the Mothman. The men in black are also known to show up anytime there's anything alien or UFO related. So is the Mothman an alien, or is he just a supernatural manifestation like a ghost, a demon, a tulpa, or some sort of previously unknown species of animal? There's a theory that states that Mothman is a highly evolved creature from 3 million years in the future, and the Mibs are time cops that were sent to wrangle him back to his rightful time. This theory persists because MIBs have been known to show up when other credible cryptid sightings happen, like Nessie, the Chupacabra, certain Bigfoot sightings, Thunderbirds, skunk apes, etc. They've also been linked to poltergeist cases as well. But if you're one of my viewers, you know that the Men in Black are just the salesmen. They're just car salesmen for the New World Order. So, what does that make the Mothman then? Is he like the inflatable gorilla mascot for the Men in Black New World Order car salesman? Nah, that would be cool though. The Mothman is actually Indrid Cold, aka Apol. They're the same person. And they are a person. Think about it. How did Mothman get his name? Killer Moth from the Batman comics. Batman, a non-superpowered superhero who was so set on avenging the deaths of his parents, he put on a costume and uses his immense wealth left to him by his dead parents to have cool gadgets to fight crime. And the Killer Moth villain character was the opposite of that. A non-superpowered supervillain who used his immense wealth to cause chaos and destruction and death. Think about it. There's a super rich guy in Point Pleasant, in that area. He stumbles upon some abandoned or forgotten military technology in the ruins of the TNT factory. Using that technology, he makes a flying ship that looks like an oil lamp. He somehow figures out how to tap into the space-time continuum to sustain anti-gravity, which gives him tidbits of info from the future also, because, he's tapped into the space-time continuum. I'm not a physicist. I don't know how it works. I'm just telling you what I know. He realizes a disaster is going to strike the Silver Bridge, but he can't just go to the authorities or pay to fix the bridge with his immense wealth. So he makes a moth costume and equips it with anti-gravity abilities like his ship. And he also starts hanging out with Derenberger as Indrid Cold. And then he realizes Derenberger is crazy, and this plan is stupid, because one time Indrid Cold took Derenberger to a party in the Hamptons, and Derenberger was convinced that they were on another planet, and that he could get naked because there were no wars on this planet. And then he started saying that everybody at the party were aliens, and they got Derenberger pregnant. So Indrid Cold checked Derenberger into a mental institution for 6 months, and ditched Derenberger after that. And so he committed solely to the moth costume idea. And while that's happening, he's flying around town in this moth costume, looking kind of like Arthur from The Tick. And then he starts doing this to freak everybody out and get the government into the town to investigate Mothman. And hopefully while investigating Mothman, they'll realize that there's a problem with the bridge and take care of it. But then the Men in Black show up, trying to sell Lincolns and Cadillacs. And then NICAP gets involved. And the government gives up because they've had it with the UFO nerds and the weird New World Order car salesman. And the government says that the Mothman is just birds and everything is fine. So nobody's going to take care of the bridge. So Indrid gets out of the costume, flies to Long Island where John Keel is, and then he poses as a man named Apol, A-P-O-L. He does this to warn of a bridge collapse, and using the space-time continuum bullshit, he was able to project that message onto the page into Jane's brain, and then also using the same space-time continuum bullshit, he was able to possess Jane in a way to tell John Keel of the imminent bridge collapse, so John Keel could save everybody. But John Keel didn't tell anybody. Instead, he just published a book. So Indrid was so upset using the space-time continuum bullshit, he remains young, and he travels around the world trying to warn of disasters, but never actually succeeds at warning of disasters. So Indrid got so upset over the whole situation, he uses the space-time continuum bullshit to stay young, and he still continues to dress up as the Mothman, and travels around the world trying to warn of disasters, but never actually succeeding. So at the end of the day, the Mothman is just a rich fuck who wishes he could be Batman, but he sucks at it. And all he has to do is land and tell us, "Yo, disaster is coming. I am Mothman." Instead, his suit is so infused with space-time continuum anti-gravity bullshit that it gives people sunburned pink eyes. Basically, my point, Mothman, you're a loser. Get a job. Stop living off of your space-time continuum trust fund, you bitch. I mean, they celebrate you every year in Point Pleasant in September during the Mothman Festival. They built you a fucking statue and a museum. They have guest speakers in your honor every year at the Mothman Festival. They have pancake eating contests, even a hayride tour of the town, all because of you, Mothman. That's nice, but you failed as a superhero. But Point Pleasant, West Virginia thanks you, because without you, they'd have no tourism. Without you, Mothman, they'd just be known as the town where the weird shit happened and a bridge fell. But you saved the town finances, Mothman. And in this capitalist society, maybe that's the hero we need. Not a hero that will save 46 people from dying in a horrible bridge collapse, but a hero that saves the town from bankruptcy at the expense of those 46 people dying in a horrible bridge collapse. Mothman sucks. Though there are petitions to replace every Confederate monument in the country with a statue of Mothman, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is definitely an America I want to live in. We deserve a fucking Mothman statue on every goddamn corner in this country. And I'm serious. We need to get on that, get this petition signed, get it passed through, replace all those statues. This is the first thing that needs to happen before prison reform, before Medicare for all reform, before, mental health reform, before, a justice system overhaul, before even addressing the flaws within our two-party system. We need to replace those Confederate statues with Mothman statues. And that's why if you look in the description below, you will be able to sign the petition, because I have a link to it. And I want you to sign it. I'm serious. Because that's an America we all deserve to live in. Anyways, fuck the Mothman. Thanks for tuning in. God bless. Hell Santa.
The only news that matters is a production of the Children's Television Workshop. Promotional consideration provided by...
Now an important message for students everywhere. Don't go back to school. Without a Papermate pen, especially the new Papermate Capri. For with the piggyback refill, you will never be caught short during a test or exam. Now remember, don't go back to school without a Papermate pen.
And by viewers like you. Thank you.
New! The beautiful new Papermate Capri with the piggyback refill. Oh, Papermate has a new pen. There's none to compare. With the piggyback refill, you've always a spare.
That's right. The Papermate Capri is the only pen with a built-in spare refill. So if you damage the point or run out of ink, just unscrew the cap and take out the piggyback refill. You see, it has 2 points, 2 ink supplies, one on top of the other, sort of
piggyback.
Reverse the sections like this, replace the refill, and you're all ready to write again with a completely new point and a completely new ink supply. With Papermate's built-in spare refill, there's no need to run out of ink, ever.
So buy a Papermate. You'll say it's great when you write with a Papermate pen. With the piggyback refill.